When it comes to the most underrated video game system of all time, my pick will always be the Sega Saturn because, well, it didn't do what a lot of people expected it to do. It was supposed to set the world on fire, and a botched launch with a change of release date had manufacturers and retailers struggling to get the system into the store. The original PlayStation came along at the $299 price point, and of course you had the architecture of the Sega Saturn that made it a bit more difficult to work on it than the Sony PlayStation did. I've talked about it before on the channel, a lot of other YouTubers have talked about it before. Maybe if this video does well though, I'll revisit the topic now that I know a bit more about it, but the Sega Saturn honestly was doomed from its start. But that doesn't mean that there aren't fantastic games that are available on that system that are still, a lot of these games are only available on that system and have never been released outside of the Sega Saturn's ecosystem. So in today's video, I want to talk about 10 must-play Sega Saturn games. These, in my opinion, are the pinnacle of the Sega Saturn. There's going to be games that you would expect to be on this list that are missing, and that's okay. This is just my personal list. Be sure to give me your list in the comment section down below. But I feel like every one of these games has a story to me. It has an attachment to me that makes it a bit more personal. So if this is your first time on the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. But let's just jump into my list of 10 must-play Sega Saturn games. However you have to play them, just emulate them. I don't care, because some of these games are very expensive. The first game we're going to talk about is Nights into Dreams. Now, I remember the first time I saw Nights into Dreams, it was at a KB toy store. A lot of you younger kids probably don't know what the hell a KB toy store is, but it was essentially your one-stop shop for all your Power Ranger toys or G.I. Joes and your video games. They used to have these kiosks set up where you could check out some of the latest and greatest games and systems. And I remember walking into a KB toy store and seeing and hearing Nights into Dreams on the Sega Saturn. I was just absolutely blown away. I still get goosebumps thinking about the first time I saw this game. And I think it really boils down to the color palette that they used in this game, because it's just so bright and vibrant and cheerful. And yeah, there were a ton of games that were sort of done in that similar style, but none of them looked like Nights. None of them felt like Nights. None of them had the magic that Nights had. At its core, it's kind of a weird game. You know, it was made by Sonic Team and Yuji Naka, because obviously there wasn't a proper Sonic the Hedgehog game on the system, but this was kind of supposed to be like a new mascot for Sega. And I think it was pretty successful in what it tried to do. They had an Archie comic for it. The gameplay, how it's structured, is kind of interesting. Think of it as a 3D background on a 2D plane. You essentially move mostly on a 2D plane collecting orbs. You play as either a boy or a girl, Claire or Elliot, and you're basically trying to escape the dream world, because in the real world you have issues going on. It's not an in-depth story or anything like that, but it's interesting enough to see the outcome of it. But you're really just playing it for the gameplay. You're really playing it to collect the orbs in a certain amount of time and then get to the next checkpoint and then get to the next segment of the level. I think the boss battles in the game are really fun and really well done. So overall, this is a magical game to me. And I know a lot of people make fun of me for being such a Nights fan, but like, because, you know, because I'm more of a masculine style person, and you look at this androgynous character and you're like, that's not something RGT would like. And you're right. I don't like Nights. I love Nights. I think it's a phenomenal game, phenomenal soundtrack, beautiful graphics that still hold up today, and a game that holds a very special place in my heart. The rise of horror games really started out during the 32 and 64-bit generation, after games like Splatterhouse kind of made their impact on things. And I think Enemy Zero on the Sega Saturn is one of the forgotten survival horror games that shouldn't have been forgotten about. This game was made by Warp, and Warp is of course known for games like D and D2. What was interesting about Warp's philosophy with developing a game was they essentially wanted to make like characters and have them pretty much be portrayed as actors and then put them in their various games. If you've ever played D or D2, you'll automatically recognize the main character of the game, Laura, because she's in all those games as well. In Enemy Zero, you wake up from a cryogenic sleep as you're on a spaceship and something seems a bit amiss. It's an interesting game in how it's portrayed, because it's really a tale of two games sort of mixed into one. Half of the game has you doing basically a bit of a point-and-click style game, where in a pre-rendered room, and you're having to search the room to find certain clues, such as key cards or something to help advance the story. Then when you get out into the corridors of the game, you start to realize it kind of has a first-person shooter element to it. Now, there's an alien on this ship. It's pretty much killing everyone in very grotesque ways. I remember as a youngster really enjoying all the grotesque violence in this because it really sort of pushed the boundaries of what you could do. And when you're in these hallway corridors, you hear the alien. You actually never see the alien because the alien itself is invisible. What ends up happening is you have this meter that sort of does a pulsating sound, and the faster that the pulse gets, the closer you're getting to the enemy, known as Enemy Zero. Once you get close enough and it's just beeping at a very high pace, you fire a shot and you hope that you hit him, because if you don't, he's gonna take you out. It's a very interesting mechanic, and I think not being able to see the enemy actually adds a lot into the horror of the game and the fear factor of it. Like I said, the story itself is very well done. It's very similar to an Alien style movie, but I always really enjoyed this game. It's super expensive now and spans across multiple discs, so definitely emulate this one. But if you're a survival horror fan and you've never played Enemy Zero, it can be a bit frustrating. It can feel a bit clunky in the point and click style areas because there are times where you'll miss something and you weren't supposed to miss it. But overall, this is a fantastic game that I think a lot of people just don't know about. 2D fighting games really shined on the Sega Saturn, and I could have picked from one of a variety of them. Capcom was on their game when it came to the 2D fighting games on the Sega Saturn, and they looked and played better than they did on the PlayStation because of the architecture of the Sega Saturn. Now, I could have picked Street Fighter Alpha 2, that seems to be like the default for a lot of people. Maybe even, you know, the games that only came out in Japan that you can play on your Sega Saturn. But for me, I'm going to pick X-Men Children of the Atom. Now, I remember I had stepped on a rusty nail at my house and I had to go get a tetanus shot. After the tetanus shot, my mom felt bad for me. We went to the mall, which had an arcade in it, and I played X-Men Children of the Atom at that arcade, and I absolutely fell in love. I was like, this is amazing. Why can't I play this game at home? I remember going to a Kroger, because Kroger used to rent video games, and at this Kroger, they had a Sega Saturn that you could rent for a weekend for $20 and a copy of X-Men Children of the Atom. I instantly fell in love with this game. I instantly fell in love with all of the characters, the visual style, the fast-paced gameplay, and the thing about X-Men Children of the Atom that really sticks out to me is it didn't need, you know, the 4 megabyte cartridge that you would put in the Sega Saturn to give it that additional oomph. This was all just running on the base system. And yes, you could say the same thing about Street Fighter Alpha 2, but there was just something really fun about this game. You know, it was a Capcom fighting game with X-Men characters. And if you were a 90s kid, X-Men were one of the biggest things out there. The X-Men animated series was absolutely huge at this time. I loved all the different characters. I loved all the special moves and how it would sort of, you know, change up the visual style of the game. The characters themselves were all big and bright and colorful with intricate details on them. It's a masterpiece of a 2D fighting game. An absolute gem on the Sega Saturn, and a game that I highly recommend playing. X-Men Children of the Atom, you can't go wrong with it. During the 16-bit era, we saw a ton of beat-em-up games, with games such as Streets of Rage, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time, and these were considered some of the best games on their respective platforms. When it came to the 32-bit era, though, we definitely saw a bit of a decrease in these brawler-style games, but one that was definitely sticking out to me, and is one of my favorite games of all time, is Die Hard Arcade. Now, the funny thing about Die Hard Arcade is, it's not really based on Die Hard at all. It was a late decision by Sega of USA to take a game that was known as Dynamite Cop in Japan and give it the Die Hard license to sort of have a pseudo John McClane in the game because he's trying to rescue a president's daughter. I guess it kind of works, but this game is absolutely fantastic. Once again, there is a personal story attached to it. I remember my parents were looking at a timeshare in Florida when we were on a vacation there, and there was an arcade that they had there. So the guy who was trying to sell my parents on this timeshare gave me a bunch of coins and said, go to the arcade and have fun while I try to scam your parents out of money. And I was like, yes, sir. I went to that arcade and Die Hard Arcade was there, and I was like, this is the one, boys. I sat there and used all of my tokens playing that game and beat it, and I just thought it was absolutely fantastic. It was so much fun. And the Sega Saturn edition, once again, is a great representation of that arcade game. It looks pretty much the same. It plays exactly the same. It was cool because you had these little quick time events that would happen in between sort of segments of levels that would have you press a button at a certain time in order to do something. It wouldn't necessarily impede your progress, but it would make your progress a little bit easier. There's a whole variety of weapons. The combat system is pretty in-depth. The levels themselves have a great variety to them. Just top to bottom, it's one of the best beat 'em up games of all time, and people always assimilate it with Die Hard when they really shouldn't. Of course, there was a sequel that was done on the Dreamcast with Dynamite Cop 2, but Die Hard Arcade on the Sega Saturn is yet another great example of an arcade game being brought home that was a Sega arcade game and running and looking and playing almost as well as its arcade counterpart, which at that time was a novel concept. You know, of course, you had the Neo Geo, but as far as your mainline consoles were concerned, this wasn't something you really had the opportunity to do until the 32-bit era. Die Hard Arcade, an absolutely fantastic game. Another facet of 90s gaming that of course was extremely popular was light gun games. Light gun games were all the rage at arcades, and you had a good variety of them available on the Sega Saturn, whether you're talking about arcade hits such as Virtual Cop 1, Virtual Cop 2, or even games from third-party companies like Area 51. There was a ton of different light gun games to play on the Sega Saturn. But when it comes to my favorite, it's going to be a controversial pick. Virtual Cop 2 arguably is the better game, but I don't care. It's my list, and we are going with House of the Dead. I absolutely love the first and pretty much all of the House of the Dead games, but the first one definitely has that nostalgia to me. I remember once again, I was at that same arcade that I went to at the mall, and I was playing the House of the Dead arcade game. Absolutely blown away by it. And I was sitting there playing it, and this older Asian kid came up to me. He was probably 17 or so. I remember he had like a big earring, and he was like, "Can I play with you?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course, dude." And he was teaching me stuff. He taught me how to hold the gun and sort of tap the trigger to get better shots going on. And it was just a really fun experience hanging out with this strange kid, which of course is what arcades did. Now, when House of the Dead came out on the Sega Saturn, it was a rush job. There were rush jobs when the system first came out. There were rush jobs when the system was starting to end its life cycle. And House of the Dead was definitely a rush job. It could have looked a lot better, definitely. But the core gameplay was still there, and the core game itself was still fun. You know, the whole going through a Resident Evil style mansion and having to deal with zombies and different monsters and stuff was still a pretty novel concept when this game came out, and was something that definitely wasn't an oversaturated thing. Most importantly, the game still plays great. The light gun feels very proper when playing this game, and everything feels accurate. Like I said, Virtual Cop 2 is arguably the better light gun game, but I always hold a special place for House of the Dead in my heart, and I think it's a game that everyone should play. Speaking of rush job ports for the Sega Saturn, one of the most infamous rush jobs of all time was Daytona USA. Now, I remember going into various arcades and hearing do 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 Daytona, and it was hypnotic to me. Like when I heard that, I was like, okay, we got to go find the Daytona USA arcade machine because that is the game I'm going to play. It was just such a beautiful looking, fast-paced, and fun racing game in the arcades. And when this game came out along the launch of the Sega Saturn, they totally butchered this game. It was not a good version of the game, which is very unfortunate, and it left a very sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. Now, Sega thankfully did somewhat rectify this with Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition, which is pretty much the definitive version of this game on the Sega Saturn. The original version of the Sega Saturn game ran at like 20 frames per second at times, where this has a much more consistent frame rate. The draw distance is better. They've added in more stuff, more races, more different cars that you can use. Now, they did sort of mess with the soundtrack a little bit, which is what I don't like. You can actually pick up the Japanese edition of this game, which has the original and remix soundtrack, but if you don't really have nostalgia for the soundtrack, it probably doesn't matter anyways. The amount of content that they put in Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition, the fixing of the graphics, the much smoother frame rate, and the much better draw distance make for a much better gameplay experience. It's one of my favorite racing games on the system, and it's still a game that I could play today for hours and hours and just have a lot of fun playing it. And that's what arcade racing games were all about during that time frame. One of the best strategy RPGs of all time sits unfinished on the Sega Saturn with Shining Force 3. Now, when I say unfinished, I mean the story of the game. Shining Force 3 actually released in 3 different parts. Shining Force 3, Part 1, 2, and 3. Now, Japan got all 3 versions of this game, completing the whole story. But when it comes to North America, we only got Shining Force 3, Part 1, which is known as Shining Force 3. So you never really got the conclusion of the story, which kind of sucks a bit. But it doesn't matter to me because Shining Force 3 is one of the best strategy RPG games of all time. It does so many things right, it does so many things well, and the game itself is just absolutely phenomenal to play. It's of course your traditional strategy RPG game. It doesn't really do anything crazy in terms of the story, but there's enough stuff going on to keep you interested. You play a strategy RPG game though for the combat, and the combat in this game is absolutely top notch. You of course have a big variety of characters that you end up being able to control, like mages and clerics and people with lances on horses and people that have big blades and stuff like that. And just moving your different characters around the map is just so seamless and so much fun. The game takes you on a pretty epic journey across the world that you're in, and you have so many different areas that you end up fighting in, it really feels just like a fresh game. You're always excited for the next battle and the next sort of story element within this game. Since strategy RPGs have become very popular, this game might look a little bit dated, but I feel like if you're a fan of strategy RPG games, this is one of the best strategy RPG games that, like I said, it's another game that's stuck on the Sega Saturn, so you've probably never played it unless you owned it on the Saturn. Another very expensive game, so make sure you get out your emulators for this, but I absolutely love this game to death. How about a different type of strategy RPG that really is just one of the most visually impressive games on the Sega Saturn? That of course would have to be Dragon Force. Now, I remember seeing Dragon Force in magazines back in the day and just being absolutely blown away at the amount of characters that you had on the screen. I wanted to buy the game. It was $70 at my local video game store because they wouldn't go by MSRPs. They would always mark stuff up. The place was called Buy Right Video Games. They went out of business. They have a terrible rating on the Better Business Bureau. So go to hell, Buy Right Games. Because of Buy Right Games, I never got to play this game as a kid. I actually did not get to play this game until I was an adult. And really, there's a steep learning curve with this game. I'm still not 100% sure I fully understand the overworld map and how everything works within it. And that's playing it as an adult. There's a very steep learning curve to this game, but once you get into the battles, all that stuff just goes away. When you see literally dozens and almost hundreds of characters on screen battling back and forth, it's absolutely crazy to see. They're 2D sprites on a 3D polygonal background, and it's just absolutely amazing. The combat itself is very fun, trying to position your troops to either be, you know, moving forward and advancing or defending or what you want to do with that. And there's so much variety in how you can fight and recruit different people in this game that it keeps things fresh throughout the adventure. I have to admit, I haven't gotten super far in Dragon Force because it's a challenging game and it's a very sort of confusing game within this overworld. However, if you're a seasoned strategy RPG fan, you definitely owe it to yourself to check out Dragon Force. They also did a sequel on the Sega Saturn that only came out in Japan, but Dragon Force on the Sega Saturn is one of the most unique strategy RPG games of all time, and I still think it holds up very, very well in 2022 and beyond. The Panzer Dragoon series was absolutely amazing with the Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon 2. Kind of think of Star Fox but with dragons, and that's sort of what you have with Panzer Dragoon. And these games were absolutely awesome. Both of these games could have easily been on this list, but when it comes to Panzer Dragoon, it's a trilogy on the Sega Saturn, and I'm gonna have to go with Panzer Dragoon Saga. One of the most expensive games on the Sega Saturn. Huge thank you to Milton Chen for sending me that game and Dragon Force back in the day.
Here's the letter. My name is Milton Chen and I'm a gamer. I found a channel about a year ago and enjoy it very much. You seem very honest. Milton. I'm done. I am done. Milton! Milton!
I love you, Milton. I'm glad I got to meet you in person. I hope you're doing well, buddy. I hope the family is doing well. But Milton Chen sent me Panzer Dragoon Saga and Dragon Force because I really felt like these were two games I was never going to be able to play. And when I finally played Panzer Dragoon Saga, it was worth the wait to me, because whereas the original first 2 Panzer Dragoon games definitely played a lot like a Star Fox 64, this was actually a more traditional RPG style in which you would visit towns and buy items and have to do side quests. There was still the dragon-based combat, but instead of being in real time, it was done like a turn-based RPG. It's one of the most beautiful looking games on the Sega Saturn, and one of the things that the Sega Saturn was not known for was, of course, the fact that the system allegedly couldn't do fully polygonal 3D graphics like the PlayStation 1 and of course the N64 can do. But Panzer Dragoon Saga really proved everyone wrong. It was a game that was kind of the swan song for the Sega Saturn. It was one of the last games that came out on the system, and today it fetches a very high price. But you know what? It's just an imaginative game. It's a really interesting game, and on a system that didn't have a lot of traditional, more action RPGs like it, it's a game that stands the test of time. It's honestly one of the most important video games of all time, because it showed you a glimpse of what the Sega Saturn was truly capable of when you had a proper development cycle for a game and a team who knew the hardware. Sega got the most out of the Sega Saturn time and time again, and Panzer Dragoon Saga is a semblance of that. They will have to bury me with my copy of the game because I will never sell that game. Absolutely amazing, breathtaking game, especially for that time frame, and honestly one of the best games probably of all time. So we've come to the final game, and you're probably noticing, hey RGT, you haven't talked about any of Sega's fighting games yet, and I mean, there's a dozen that I could choose from here. We could talk about Fighting Vipers, we could talk about Last Bronx, we could talk about Fighters Mega Mix, but I'm gonna keep it cliche. I'm gonna go with arguably the most important game on the Sega Saturn. I think it was actually the best-selling game on the Sega Saturn as well, and that is Virtua Fighter 2. Now, Virtua Fighter 1 was a phenomenal game, but Virtua Fighter 2 really stepped it up in terms of presentation, the amount of characters that you had, the beautiful backgrounds, the excellent music in the game, and this game is just magical to me. It's a strategy sort of fighting game in which you could kind of button mash, but you got to learn the moves. You got to learn the amount of moves that each character has, and there's so many moves that each character has, and once you master a character, you really become a master of your domain with this game. Now, of course, Virtua Fighter 2 originally released in arcades, and when the Sega Saturn version hit, it was mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing how close to the arcade version that they got with this game in terms of the visuals, in terms of the music, in terms of everything. This game is just a top-notch game from top to bottom. It's a game that I will still play today, and I will throw it up there with the 3D fighters of this current era. Just a magical game, a magical looking game, so many different fighting styles to master in the game as well, so many cool moves, a few hidden secrets here and there, but really it's just a timeless game. And I think that's what really boils down the Sega Saturn to me, is just how many of these games are timeless games, games that you could still pop in and enjoy, and you don't have to sink dozens and dozens of hours into it. You could play some Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition, you could play some Virtua Fighter 2, you could play some XMen Children of the Atom or Knights, and just enjoy them in little small sample sizes, get in and get out. If you want a deeper experience, you could go with games like Enemy Zero or Dragon Force or Shining Force 3. The variety on the Sega Saturn was criminally underrated, and it was missing a lot of stuff on there, and yes, the library does probably pale in comparison to what the PlayStation 1 offered, but I will always love the Sega Saturn. A phenomenal system with a phenomenal library of games, and hopefully some of these games will interest you, and if you've never checked them out before, maybe you'll check them out. So let me know what you think of these games and my list in the comment section down below. Like I said, I probably could have done a top 50 very easily. Like, there's so many other games, A Stall, Mr. Bones, games that I just absolutely love, but these were the 10 that definitely stick out to me. If I had to be selling my Sega Saturn collection, these 10 games would go absolutely nowhere because they're the ones I play the most. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button, like, comment, and share. Hit the bell notification as well. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Later.
Introducing Sega Saturn. Aww. Hit it. Sega's next-generation gaming platform. Revolutionary sports and arcade gameplay.